Before Wild at Heart came into formation, David Lynch was waiting for something to do. He'd just got the closest he'd perhaps ever got to making a passion project that he was working on throughout his career, and after almost every single one of his films, he tried to make this project called Ronnie Rocket, subtitled The Absurd Mystery of the Strange Forces of Existence, which is my ticket sold. From what I've read, it was like a cross between The Elephant Man and the more surreal sequences of Twin Peaks. The general basis was a teenager with dwarfism is regularly plugged into electricity mains to stay alive after a surgery goes wrong. This then gives him the power to control electricity, which he uses to become a destructive rock star, and while all this is happening, there's a detective trying to find a second dimension through his ability to stand on one leg. He travels through multiple rooms and a train whilst being followed by a group of electricity wielders known as the Donut Men. Again, my ticket sold. And as I say, Lynch tried to make this film happen for years. There are a couple of versions of the screenplay, I believe, online. He was working on it from Eraserhead in 1977, and there's at least one draft that's known of from 2012. He frequently spoke about it as an idea he was constantly tinkering with to longtime collaborators, and in 1987, after Blue Velvet, he returned to England where he filmed The Elephant Man to scout the north for possible filming locations. However, the industrial areas that he had in mind now looked too modernised, and as the years went on, the budget would either go up or just couldn't be justified, and while at one point he considered an ultra-low budget Eraserhead-style production, that never happened either. But the thing that really stopped Ronnie Rocket from coming to fruition on this occasion was the fact that the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group filed for bankruptcy and funding was therefore pulled, which similarly happened when the film was under Francis Ford Coppola's American Zoetrope in the early 80s. Now, this is all a very rambling way of saying that with the Twin Peaks pilot almost complete and the various projects he was setting up outside of that all coming to a sudden halt, Lynch found himself waiting for something to do, waiting for the next idea. And the associate producer of the Twin Peaks pilot, Monty Montgomery, turned to author Barry Gifford, who he knew, and asked if there was anything he was working on that he could take a look at. And Gifford gave him an unfinished copy of Wild at Heart. It had about 2 chapters left to go. And he read it, gave it straight to Lynch, and Lynch fell in love with the characters of Sailor and Lula. So much so that apparently 85% of the novel's dialogue made its way into the film. However, one day on set, Gifford mentioned to Lynch that what he believed to be the most important line in the novel wasn't in the film, and that was "This whole world's wild at heart and weird on top." And Lynch said, "You're right," and so he added it in. But in the novel, it's at the very start, and where Lynch includes it, it ends up having a very different meaning. There is perhaps one big change from the novel, and it's one that Lynch worried about, and that's the ending. Now, I'm not going to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen the film, but he really wanted to change it, but was uncertain about how people would respond. He didn't want to make something too commercial, but at the same time wanted to be true to what the material was saying to him. And in the end, he changed it to capture this idea of finding love in hell and what that means. Wild at Heart is said by some to be controversial. At least when it was first released, it was divisive after some booed it when it won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, although Cannes can often be a place of exaggerated responses and then reporting. But while this isn't my favourite Lynch film, I do think it's the one that's perhaps aged the best. And that's not to say that his other films have dated or aged poorly, but I believe that a number of the themes and ideas within Wild at Heart feel particularly more resonant and perhaps talked about now than they were 35 years ago. Or maybe there's just more of an open dialogue about healthy relationships. For both characters, of everything that they've been through and subjected to, there's a comfort and safety in their relationship. One that's made up of an understanding between two people who, by not allowing the surrounding world to hold them back, are very much themselves. One declaring this by wearing a snakeskin jacket which represents a symbol of his individuality and belief in personal freedom. A jacket which was Nicolas Cage's idea and worked into the script by Lynch, who was constantly rewriting during production, to the point where apparently Cage was a method actor before this, and the constant changes to the script and production caused him to take a step back from that so that he could keep up. But I think there are elements of the character that stayed with him for a while after, because after all, this is the film that gave us that entrance on Wogan. If you have never seen Nick Cage promoting Wild at Heart on Wogan, after the film, when you get home, Just look it up on YouTube. It is one of the great talk show moments, just pure chaos. Meanwhile, in terms of the characters, Laura Dern's Lula, there's an openness to the tragedy and trauma that she's faced. And she isn't played as a victim, but a survivor. There's a great piece that I read about this that was written for Little White Lies a couple of years ago. Now, there's often the question of, is any sex scene necessary? And I'm not going to try and provide a definitive answer for that because I'm too awkward to do so. But I think that the ones in Wild at Heart do a good job of saying that in this case, the answer may at least be close to yes. There's almost a reclamation in the closeness and openness of the intimate moments between Lula and Cage's sailor, particularly in the dialogue afterwards, which is often the main focus and perhaps where the more explicit stuff is. They feel so tonally different to the threat that follows them in flashbacks and Willem Dafoe's Bobby. And for me, both of those elements provide some of the most terrifying moments in any of Lynch's work. The Wizard of Oz was the film paired with this as a key inspiration for Lynch, and that's a film that he said there wasn't a day that went by where he didn't think about it. I read some pieces in the build-up to this about Wild at Heart, and some of them mentioned the relationship with The Wizard of Oz, calling it unsubtle. And I really don't think you can have a conversation about subtlety in this case, because it's simply a matter that The Wizard of Oz is so much a part of the characters and their relationship. There is no place like home, and while they go on the run for a physical one, they are each other's emotional home. Lynch said of The Wizard of Oz something that I think applies just as much to his own film, that there's a certain amount of fear in that picture, as well as things to dream about, so it seems truthful in some way. In Lynch's film, there's a real heart-stopping fear on display without that surreal layer for the main characters, as they try to find a home in a world that's wild at heart and weird on top, where the news is Night of the Living Dead and they're chased by their own wicked witch. Lynch apparently said to Laura Dern over lunch once that, when talking about Diane Ladd in this film, said, "Who would have known that your mother would be the ultimate David Lynch actor?" And that was in reference to Ladd's own additions and improvisations for the film. Apparently in an abortion scene that was shot, it was her idea to just stand there offering her daughter, going through that process, a lollipop. And I think that in his pursuit of what he saw as true for Lula, Sailor and the film, Lynch knocks down claims that he's an unempathetic director. He follows the couple and the dreams that they dare to dream eventually over the rainbow, whatever that may mean, whenever that may be for you. At the start, partway through, for me it said his decision to change the ending. Even amongst the strange forces of the universe, the terror that's experienced, there's a dialogue and openness in that relationship that I think has perhaps had more brought to it simply because of changing attitudes and conversations, people embracing themselves and their identities more, being more open about that. And I think it adds to this depiction of individuality and belief in personal freedom that I do believe has had more brought to it over the years since. Thank you all so much for your time. Please enjoy Wild at Heart.